alone without images, so as images can stand alone without text. It was just a vice versa situation. This is also the case for the comics, of course, and so the question then is whether definitions such as Wartenberg's erase important differences between comics and picture books. Of course, we can say that it was a comics if there's no images. It wasn't a comics if there's no text. When we say comics, we should remember that text and images were always together. It was just a logical thinking for us about it. So it should not be considered an adequate argument for sharing that the images are then optional or less important. Between text and image, there is no less important. Those two are very important when creating comics or even picture books. And there is also, however, clearly a sense that not only do the pictures go about showing much more than is given in the text, which is not too remarkable because any illustration may do this too. But also, that way they introduce is far from simply illustrative. In other words, the images take on a considerable narrative role of their own as always. So, images always play a huge role when it comes to comics and picture books. This is then one line that needs to be drawn between illustrated books and picture books. So, the more narrative load carried by the pictorial material, the more we are dealing with picture books rather than illustrated books. Now, moving on to comics, we can make further distinctions building on this, whereas picture books provide text and image combinations that relate to entire episodes. A distinctive feature of comics appears precisely to be that they engage in microscale visual narrative. So later on, we will know what microscale visual narrative is. Anyway, that is in a comic, every moment of the narrative is carried verbo-visually. And based on the reading, where they made an example, whereas the picture book might describe a few turns of dialogue between child and grandmother in a single text element presented alongside, while that is juxtaposed with a pictorial representation of a conversation between child and adult. So the comic book version would break the dialogue down into individual utterances being shown both visually and verbally. So this is visually and verbally means there's an image and text. So it is for us to better understand what comics is and how image and text is crucial to comics and picture books, also in illustrated books. And the connection between microscale visual narratives of this kind demands possibilities for expression that are beyond usual capabilities of picture books and which provide a veritable playground for exploring the deployment of space on the pages. So this is an example of pictures book. As we can see, it is more of a kind of storytelling for children. It has both text and creative images for the kids to understand the story very well. Of course, as a kid, we all know that they love to listen stories, but at the same time, seeing some images that related to the part of the story or to the part of images. That's how picture books work and comics too. That's how comics too work. Text and images at the same time when it was combined, it expand our imaginations not just as a kid but also as an individual to create a creative aesthetic view about the story. Later on, we will know more about other crucial topics of comics. But for now, we can start talking about the parts of comics that I believe Gabby and Adrienne have an opinion on. Gabby and Adrienne, take it away.
Yes, now we will move on to my spotlight. Well, of course, and the Adrian spotlight, we're going to talk about panos, gutter, and closure.
Thanks for the subtle introduction, Gab. This is Adrian, and now, before focusing on the text image relations in comics themselves, we need first to address in slightly more detail the context in which those relations occur. That is, the series of panels and collections of frames. Now, these two characterizations, in fact, correspond to two broad perspectives toward comics and its analysis, namely dimensional sequentiality, which is inherent in Eisner's naming of the medium called sequential art, while the other perspective is the two-dimensional nature of comics, which Gorenstein, McLeod, and others focus on as a page-based medium. Now, on the next slide, we have Neil Kahn. He said that these two perspectives, the dimensional sequentiality and two-dimensional nature of comics, are by no means in conflict. Both are actually necessary in order to understand the workings of comics. We also find that one interesting challenge is to explore just how it is that the readers of comics move between them so well, turning two-dimensional layouts into one-dimensional reading paths. Now, moving on to the next slide, we have closure. Closure in comics, according to McLeod, is the phenomenon of observing the parts but perceiving the whole. In other words, closure is the act of mentally filling in the gaps of what we observe, thus allowing readers to comprehend the action and meaning between two unrelated panels. And then the reader observes two separate panels and mentally pieces together what happens between them, even though there is no panel containing what actually happened in between. Lastly, closure is why comics fall under the category of full media. Because comics, it requires the readers to be constantly interacting with visual aspects and filling in the gaps between them. Now, moving on to the next slide, there are 6 types of closure. Starting off with moment to moment. Like movies or televisions, the same character here is displayed from panel to panel, developing one action. And then, as you can observe, the character closes her eyes. It's a very simple and single movement. Now, what is emphasized here is particularly time. It increases suspense, catches small changes, and creates a movie-like motion. And little closure is needed since the action is continuous and not much is happening between panels. Now, this is followed by action to action on the next slide. Action to action, it can be observed that the same character appears throughout the panels, but with this method, 2 different actions are carried out. Notice how the character, from having positioning himself on the first panel, he then whammed his bat on the second panel. Now, this requires more closure since there usually are gaps while illustrating the 2 actions. And action to action focuses on the event or how it happens. It advances the plot due to its pace being brisk. Now, third is this subject to subject. Now, on the next slide, it is like the counter shot in film, wherein 2 characters are part of the same scene. They could be talking to each other or just sharing a space or situation. In a given example, both happen at the same moment but show different subjects within the episode. Now, this requires a certain level of closure since this illustration can represent a long period of time, omitting actions and guides readers to consider the various plot elements at play. Next is Next slide, we have scene to scene. Now, this connection among panels indicates leaps in time and space. Although it is often required that the panels be part of the same narrative, this requires a great deal of closure by the reader because of the large jump in space and time. It transports its readers and it's expansive because it creates a sense of space. And we also have on the next slide, we have now aspect to aspect. According to McLeod, it bypasses time for the most part and sets a wandering eye on different aspects of a place, mood, or idea. Aspect to aspect also requires a high level of closure. It focuses on the point of view, whether it's the different aspects of a place, idea, or mood. It also shows personal perspective. It has different angles on the same scene referring to the example panels. And lastly, we have non-sequitur. Non-sequitur. These are panels with no logical relationship because of its ambient effect. Readers see this parrot image as part of a larger whole. It's basically the comic or gag effect, and it requires the most active participation of the reader because it asks for a high level of closure.
Cross-cultural comparison in comics. The dominant strategy in mainstream American comics is action to action, where successive panels show two successive narrative actions immediately following on one another. Second most common relation is subject to subject, in which successive panels show differing viewpoints within a scene without any necessary advance in time. An example would be one panel shows a woman running along the beach with her dog, followed by another panel showing how her hair gorgeously glides through the wind. Well, both happen at the same moment but show different subject within the episode. Moment-to-moment panels show what resemble single frames in a piece of film, with a minimum of change to show time is moving. So visual cues in the panel typically indicate that we have a single event broken down into individual moments. Aspect to aspect is a similar construction but without the necessary advance in time. Example is a view in one panel of a country house, followed by another panel showing the window, the door, and so on, showing another part of the house. Such transitions establishes the mood and what the creator wants the viewer or the reader to feel. Time seems to stand still in this quiet, contemplative combinations. Distinguishing subject to subject from aspect to aspect. So both present different aspects of a single scene or episode without any necessary advance in time. But the main difference is the status that the panel have for the narrative. Subject-subject relations pick out different but related activities occurring together at a point in the narrative. On the other hand, aspect-to-aspect relations pick out different states or situation holding at some point. In terms of verbal expression, they are far more like descriptions. This means that nothing happened in the panel related as aspect-to-aspect transitions. We simply see different static depictions of state of affairs that obtain. Classification of word-image relation in comics, which was suggested by McLeod in 1994. First of is the word specific. The images illustrate the text without adding anything particular new of their own. So basically, words tell the story, and pictures